welcome to Turn the Page, the official podcast of the Syosset Public Library.
Hello, and welcome to another episode of Turn the Page, the official podcast of Syosset Public Library. I'm Jenn, and I'll be your host for today. And today I'm here with the author of a really exciting and really vivid new fantasy book. Could I ask you to introduce yourself and your book, please?
Hi, I'm Sunyi Dean. I'm the author of The Book Eaters. I was born in Texas. I grew up in Hong Kong, and I now live in Leeds, which is in England. And The Book Eaters is a novel about a society of people, who eat books for food, except some of them also eat human minds, which is a bit of a darker hunger. And the main character is a woman called Devon who ends up being at odds with her own society and having a lot of issues with that. So there's a lot more going on, I guess, than just eating books in it.
I loved this book, and I'm really excited to get into it, but I was wondering if first I could just ask you about your writing career in general, because this is your first novel, I believe, right? But not your first foray into writing. I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit about the other things you've written and how it led you to this book.
It's the first novel I've got someone interested in buying and selling and reading. I did write two others before this. The first one was not fit for Man or Beast, so no one has seen it. The second one, I did find an agent, but publishers didn't buy it for various reasons. I do think it needed loads of work. And in between that, I've also written some short fiction, so not very often. I take ages to write short fiction, probably longer than I do for a novel on a word count basis. I think, I tend to rewrite a book over and over to try and get it right. I don't like to leave things behind. So I kind of rewrote the first couple of books a lot while doing short fiction, and eventually got to this one, which was a 2, 3, 4-year endeavor, I think, total, including all the edits done with Tor.
Oh, wow. That is super interesting. And it does lead me to another question. I saw when I was looking at your website that you had a blog actually about your publishing process. And I thought that was so interesting. And it was such a nice service for other writers as an insight into, what you have to do to get published. I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about that and how, why you decided to narrate your process like that.
Yeah, so when I was querying and writing, I looked for a lot of those stories. And usually the ones that you kind of read about, I guess they're kind of very J.K. Rowling stories where, she had 12 rejections, which is like nothing in trade publishing, and then she kind of effectively rocketed success in industry terms. And that's very demoralizing when you're querying and you're rewriting and slogging away. And I think the first kind of author I found who talked more openly about the difficulty in publishing was like Cameron Hurley, and she has a fantastic blog where she goes through her years of trying to break into the industry and really struggling with it. And I found that very refreshing and also very helpful to reset my expectations that you're not just going to send off a letter and get elevated to success. And I thought writing it, I think it's partly, a lot of it is maybe catharsis for me to write about that process, but also I think a lot of people who are in that situation, like a lot of parents or single parents or people who don't necessarily have a lot of financial means, can maybe see something a little more relatable in that, because a lot of publishing, especially not so much nowadays, it's getting better, but it definitely used to be like you can't really write successfully unless you're well off or supported or very lucky. So
that's absolutely true, and it makes a ton of sense. Because the only stories that you do tend to hear about are the quote unquote overnight successes, even though it wasn't even overnight for them. It's just like it is not as long as it is for some other writers to get published. And there's just, I think, so many good stories that are waiting to get published, and the time that it takes for them to get published means absolutely nothing about how good it is or how interesting it is or how publish worthy it is. It's such a gamble.
Mhm. Yeah, there's a lot of timing in publishing. I think there's a lot of I definitely think, looking at my friends now who are still querying or still seeking agents or still on submission, and it's very different from 2 or 3 years ago. It gets harder all the time. And that stuff comes and goes in cycles, but it's definitely very difficult now, I think, for people to break in.
Yeah, that's a good point. And I wonder if it's because trend cycles have sped up so much. We sort of like move through trends so much more quickly, but novels still take a really long time to write. And so, like the timing of when you finish your novel is just, yeah, it completely tangential to like what is, going on in publishing at the time. So it's a weird kind of kismet you sort of need.
Yeah, I think that's why I always tell people not to worry about trends with trade publishing, because when I started writing, everyone was saying, "Oh, don't write adult fantasy, no one buys it, everything's YA." And at some point when I was querying my second novel, the YA bubble really burst for publishing. The same thing for adult fantasy, it's sort of made a comeback at the same time, and genres go in and out of fashion all the time, and there's just no point kind of chasing that, because you might as well write what you can and have a backlog, and then you've always got things to query and always got things to try.
Yeah, absolutely. Also, let's dig into the book. I One of the things I loved about it, and this is one of the first things I noticed, is that you have book quotes that open every chapter. And, this is a great idea for a book that is about books and people who depend on books. What I love in particular is the mix of like real books in there with sort of like fictional texts that exist within the world of the book. And I'm just want to, if you could talk a little bit about how you landed on that technique and like the mixing of truth and fiction in that way.
And so it started as an organizational thing, because there's a dual timeline in Book Eaters. There's a past and a present. So I think, which way around is it? The past timeline is all real quotes, and that just helped me keep it straight. And the present timeline was all kind of the fictional textbook that one of the characters in the book is writing about the people that he's studying. And I always kind of liked epigraphs as like a cheaty world building thing. I remember reading ages ago a novel by Neil Asher called The Skinner, and each chapter had a little epigraph that was like a mini story, and the story was continuous. So you've got an extra little story at the start of each chapter that built into a bigger thing throughout the book. And I think it's just a really useful way to kind of, it's like it's optional, people can skip it, but it also has world building if they want to read it, and it's just kind of fun and mood setting, and maybe sometimes a little bit of foreshadowing.
Yeah, it's really fun to see how they comment on the text, and also the way that mixing in the real books with the book written by a character in it sort of like lends the whole story a more grounded feeling of like, oh, this is like a historically cited event with like, and look, there's like this, almost like a footnoted text, like it's just an interesting structure that gives it like a little bit of weight of reality. Yeah, and I love like the kind of books that they come from too, because you have some that are fairy tales, which are like the kind of books that our main character Devon is allowed to eat, and then other books that would probably be like forbidden to her. So could you talk a little bit about the way that book eating functions and how it sort of plays into how their society is organized?
Okay, so the book eaters, obviously they eat books, and everything they eat, they consume, they remember it forever. They're like these kind of walking libraries that are sentient almost. And the things that they eat, they really absorb. I mean, anything that we read or see on television has an impact on us. And I remember this actually growing up when I was religious, they would always say in Sunday school, like, you need to be careful what you consume because it will shape your mind and stuff. And that's why you're only supposed to watch G-rated films, ideally ones that are about Jesus. And, sorry, so the book eaters, that's magnified for them, that effect, because they remember everything so acutely. And the people who kind of control their society and are trying to keep their species alive use that against their own people to make sure that they only eat things which give them the right ideas and shape their minds to see the right things and think about the right things. Because what we consume and what we think about really gives us a frame of reference for interacting with reality. And then against that, the book eaters themselves, they're not actually very creative as a species. Even things like their name. I think there's one point where Devon talks about the fact, like she meets a human who calls them like Librarians or something. And she's kind of reflecting the fact that, only a human would come up with that. They call themselves book eaters because they're not very inventive, basically. So they really live by the book. And that's good for them and bad for them in different ways, often bad for most of the book.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I love it as an image and just as like a world building detail because like as somebody who has been described as like a voracious reader, like I've often felt like a book eater, like devouring books in order to like experience another world or to gain knowledge, or even just to like forget about this world for a little while and like live in another one for a little while. And yeah, like there are periods in a person's life where or at least my life, where I felt like I did also depend on books for sustenance, so I think it's just a really neat, like it's a nice metaphor while also being like very literal.
Yeah, I think we think about books already in that way. We talk about them being kind of heavy or light or sweet or spicy, and we have lots of food metaphors for books. I think it lends itself naturally to that line of thinking.
Definitely. Yeah, and there's a lot of really interesting lines in the book about like how particular books taste, depending on like what they're about. Like in particular, I remember that Dante's Inferno tastes like brimstone and bile. And I was like, yes, that's accurate. Like I haven't even tasted it, but yes, I guess. And then also, I remember Devin describing that like new books with glossy pages taste worse than like old books. And I thought it was super interesting that like books, the word, like the physical book has a taste, but also like the text of the book has a taste too, in a way. I thought that was super
Yes.
interesting. What do you think this book would taste like if you ate it?
I think one other person asked me that, and I think about it. I think probably peat and blood, something like that. Peat is a kind of soil in Yorkshire moors. It's very rich and dark. It's what they flavor a lot of whiskey with. It has a very kind of smoky smell.
Yes, that's a good vibe. Yeah, that that captures it. So yeah, I would love to talk a little bit more about this world, and in particular, the role of mothers in it, because this is a very hierarchical world, almost like a sort of old school nobility type society. Um, but there's like a very interesting role that women and mothers play. The way that children are raised is pretty unique and strange, I think, to most like humans and how we raise our kids. So yeah, I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about the role that women play in this society and how Devon, the main character, sort of relates to these roles.
Okay, so book eater society has a problem with infertility, and they don't know whether it's by design or by accident, because their species was kind of artificially created. I won't go into that too much, but basically something like 1 in 7 children are women or female, and they have very limited fertility. They can only have 1 or 2 pregnancies, occasionally 3. So numerically their species is just dying out, and they try and shore it up and they try and balance it up, but they are dying out. So their efforts to survive involve a lot of arranged marriages where the women in question don't have a choice. It's all done through like basically spreadsheets and family lineages to make sure they don't interbreed. And they're just trying to stave off their own extinction, essentially. And I guess the communal thing, it's partly like, you know, who do the children belong to when you've got to marry different husbands to prevent interbreeding. So the children are sort of raised communally by the house that they're born into rather than by the mother. That's maybe a bit Platonic, I want to say. In Plato's Republic, he had this idea that children would not have parents, and he didn't believe in like parental units, and children would be raised communally and stuff. So there's a little bit influence from there. And then that means that they have this very strange structure. You grow up in a house where you don't have a mother and father. Everyone's an uncle or an aunt, and everyone else is a brother or sister.
Yeah, it's very, very interesting. And I think that like it's an interesting kind of like take on a traditional patriarchal society while also being pretty different, but also that just kind of like oppresses and objectifies women in a slightly different way than our society does. Yeah, like and Devon is so interesting, and she really like relates to these roles in a super interesting way. She really like is choosing to reject a lot of them. Could you talk a little bit about her and how she fits into her society?
I think it makes Devon a bad parent, to be honest. I think Devon's, but it's like a book about mothers, which you don't see in sci-fi, but then, sorry, sci-fi and fantasy very much, but then also Devon's own mother is absent. So she's, in a way, she's like the cliche, and she's not, because a lot of sci-fi and fantasy protagonists don't have present parents in stories, and she has, you know, she falls into that category. I think she really struggles throughout the book to be a good parent, but she has no good role models, which I think is actually familiar for a lot of people. If you grow up either without parents or parents who aren't very good, you kind of don't know what you're doing. Or even if you grow up with parents but you disagree with how they do things. I think when I had my kids, I did a lot of reading, and I met a lot of people who were like, oh, you know, you can't parent by the book. And it's like, well, books are what I have. Because books are how I learn my parenting, because I want to do things very differently. And Devon is kind of in that category as well. She's trying to do better, but she just doesn't have any kind of. So I think if you look at how she is as a parent in the book, you know, she sort of neglects Kai. She's, you know, disappears for hours, leaves him alone. She doesn't always make the right decisions. Her heart's in the right place, but maybe she goes too far in certain things or not far enough in others. And she struggles to kind of keep her promises. She lies to him a lot. There's lots of things about her where I think she's very dodgy as a parenting role model. Definitely don't copy Devon. Study her maybe for what to do or not to do, but
Yeah, like as a case study. Yeah. Because she does you know, she does clearly love Kai a lot, you know, and she is doing so much of what she does like for his long-term safety, but not having a role model of her own to base parenting on does, as you say, create this problem where like she loves him a lot but doesn't really know how to act loving toward a person, or to like love as a verb as opposed to like feel love, you know. Yeah, and she and Kai both encounter one of these book eating families that has a very tempting offer to make for them. Can you talk a little bit about the families and sort of the dynastic struggles kind of at work in society?
Okay, so when I was originally drafting the Book Eaters, it was a lot more global, and there were families everywhere. There's a whole kind of plot line in Japan and stuff. But I narrowed that down over time because there was just too much plot and too many things going on. But basically, the Book Eaters have diverged into different families, and they each have their own mini subculture or heritage they've come from. So Devon's family has a lot of Eastern European traditional vampire, I guess, in them. Right. So Devon at the start of the book is on the run from her own families, the one she married into and the one she was born into. And there is another family she's trying to contact who basically have fallen out with the others because for reasons that other people don't really understand. They just basically disappeared one day. But they were the only family who manufactured a drug that can cope with her son's condition because her son eats minds instead of books. Very kind of emotional vampire thing he's got going on. And when they disappeared, that actually set off a chain reaction of things, which eventually led to Devon having to flee her own family. But she's looking for them because to her, that's the only solution that she can have to prevent her son from either being a monster or going insane or both.
I thought the mind eaters were so interesting, and the role that they play in their society is super interesting too. And it occurred to me a lot while I was reading that it's kind of easy to see where the mind eaters come from the book eaters, because in a way, like, the book eaters are kind of eat the products of people's minds, like the mind eaters have just sort of like cut out the middleman, like they they eat the source of the book rather than like the book. And I just thought it really created an interesting situation where you could comment on like how people with particular medical needs maybe like encounter problems with like getting their conditions treated in a system where like the most powerful people kind of like hold the keys to those things. I don't really think I verbalized that very coherently, but I hope you know what I mean. Yeah.
So yeah, initially there's a lot more lore. There were like different kinds of eaters and things that I worked out. I think like one for music and one for art, and the mind eaters were almost they were kind of the ones that collected the data. They can consume their own kind and collate all of that together. But that ended up being cut because it detracted from the emotional arcs and it wasn't that relevant. But yeah, no, I do know what you mean. There's kind of, I think one of my friends taught me about it as being like a commentary on ableism sometimes. Because he's not disabled exactly, Devon's son, but he faces some of the same kinds of things in a way. He faces discrimination from his own kind, and he has needs that aren't met by the society he's in. And he's very demonized by everyone for being the way that he is, which he can't help.
Yeah, absolutely. And he ends up kind of becoming, in a way, a pawn in this bigger struggle between like families for supremacy and control. And it's just a really interesting comment too on how I think individuals can get caught up in these like power struggles between elites. I'm really interested in all this other world building, it sounds like, that you've had to sort of like put to the side in order to focus on the story. And I'm wondering do you think that's something that you'll ever return to? Do you think you'll ever expand this world or like look at those other aspects of this world you've created?
I guess just to be kind of frank about it and discuss it from a business side. So fantasy usually does sell in series, and I had it in the back of my mind that there should be enough material there that if the book ever got picked up, it could have other books in it. But Tor very strongly envisioned it as a standalone, because they didn't want to get lost in the world building, going down the rabbit hole of explaining it, which I kind of understand, because sometimes you get caught up in explaining it, it becomes like an exercise in explaining world building almost. I do want to return to it to wrap up some things, because when I originally drafted, I had this big thing of, I can't mention that spoiler. Devon goes after another character whose fate is not dealt with in this book. And that was originally all in the same story, which it's not now. There just wasn't space. So someday, yeah, I would like to at least do one more and just wrap things up for her story, and cover some of the loose ends that weren't done. There is one edition, I think, through the Waterstones here that has an epilogue, but they're the only ones that do. The epilogue does tie up a little bit more and kind of set up maybe a future sequel, but at the moment I'm not working on one because I can't. I'm tied into writing standalones for a little bit, so one day, but not now.
Well, that's great to hear. And sometimes I think that the approach of waiting can be really interesting sometimes, because I really love to see, there's a big difference between like a multiple book series that is planned with like an arc and something that's sort of like expands organically, like, and I just feel like there's like I'm very curious to see what happened, to that character. And
Good.
so I would love to return in a couple of years. So no pressure though.
Yeah, no, it's fine. I kind of know what it would be. I don't think it would be written from Devon's point of view. It would be kind of semi-standalone, but in that world, and probably from a human perspective, basically the human police force that come in to Traquair House at the end and discover the aftermath. It would be that kind of thing. So it would wrap up the story, but not necessarily have Devon as the central focus for a variety of reasons. But I'll see what it's like. see how things go the next few years.
Oh, great. Awesome. Well, thank you so much for coming to talk to us about your book. I really loved it. I thought it was such a beautiful, interesting, and scary world. And mostly I'm just really grateful for teaching me the word biblicore, like the smell of old books. I'm like, yes, that's like immediately going on my favorite word. So thank you for it.
It's a very fun word.
Yeah. Okay. All right. So listeners.
Thank you for having me. Yeah, sorry.
No, that's okay. Thank you so much. I'll edit some of that out to make it look a little smoother. So
Okay.
I think today there's been some connection issues on my end because like the internet, well, I know there's a heat wave there too, but it's also here and the internet.
Oh, it's ended now, thankfully.
Oh, has it? Okay, that's good. All right, so let's try that end again. Okay, yes, thank you for coming to talk to me and our listeners. I think this is a really wonderful book and I'm really excited to see what you write next.
Oh, thank you so much. It was really good to speak to you.
Thank you. Okay, listeners, this has been Jenn in conversation with Sunyi Dean. You can check out The Book Eaters as of August 2nd, which is actually my birthday. So it's a really lovely birthday present for me. Thank you. So
happy birthday early. Happy early birthday.
Okay. All right. So this, it is time to close this chapter.
It's time to close this chapter of Turn the Page. Join us for the next episode.